We're going to look at outputting content to a page now, and we're going to look at three main ways that we might be able to do this. We're going to look at the most basic form of just outputting a string or an integer, a float, a variable to a page, but we're just going to look at outputting strings in this case, and we're then going to include the ability to concatenate, both using comma separated values for echo and also the dot notation to concatenate strings. And then finally we'll look at the complex syntax, which basically allows you to output things like array values within a string inside of curly brackets. So this sounds very difficult, but in practice it's actually very easy. Which method you use depends on, first of all, which standards of code standard you're following, and also depends on how you're actually outputting and what you're actually outputting. If things start to get a little bit more complicated, then you might choose a different method. As long as you're consistent in the way you're outputting, generally, then you're fine. But let's take a look at a very basic example of outputting. So let's just go ahead and just echo out a string. Now, echo will basically just output whatever you specify after it to a page. So in this case, if I use single quotes or I use double quotes, this basically is a notation for a string. So in this case, I'll just output my name, and let's head over to our browser and just refresh this and see what we get out. So if we refresh the page now, you can see that we just see Alex here. And if we view the source of this page, we just see Alex on line 1, and that is it. So the same thing works with single quotes, but obviously using single quotes and double quotes is it's not as easy as just saying I want to include single quotes or I want to include double quotes. So for example, if I was using double quotes, let's just two double quotes, and I was to say I'm Alex. Now this is perfectly valid because we have a double quote here, we have a double quote here, and a single quote just in here between these two characters. So this works as expected. Now what happens if I want to output something in single quotes, and I also want to use a single quote inside of this string? Now what's going to happen here is we're going to basically, this will error. If we just go back to this page, so this will error. So we get a parse error, a syntax error, unexpected t underscore string, expecting a comma or a semicolon. So what on earth does this mean? Well, what's happening here is it's seeing this part here as a string, and it's expecting us to either end the line with a semicolon, which we do in PHP, or it's expecting us to concatenate this or provide an additional string to output with a comma. So this would work, but we're still faced with the problem that we don't have our single quote between the I and the M. So how can we combat this if we want to use single quotes on the outside but want to use a single quote on the inside? Well, we can use character escaping for this. So if we use a backslash just before the character that we want to escape, this doesn't take into account the fact that we have the single quotes on the outside, and therefore this isn't affecting the fact that we're using single quotes. So when we refresh now, we see this single quote. Now you'll probably think, oh well, it's easier to just use double quotes. And in actual fact it is, but then what happens if we want to use a double quote within this string? So for example, if I wanted to enclose Alex in double quotes, what's going to happen here? Well, we're going to receive a very similar error, unexpected Alex t string, and again the same reason as before. So how do we combat this? Well, we can of course escape these characters as we saw with a single quote, and then this works as normal. So generally, if you're just working with strings like this, escaping characters is perfectly acceptable, but remember that if you are doing it this way, then you need to keep to doing this. There is the here.doc syntax, which we'll look at later, and basically that allows us to use single or double quotes in conjunction with each other and not have to use escaping. So that's the basics of outputting within a string, either with single or double quotes, and we've also looked at escaping. Now let's take a look at actually concatenating or outputting multiple values within echo. Now, just as a side note, we can also use print, and you might see this used different places. There's no real difference between doing this, but there are some subtle differences. We're not going to go into them too much, but we're just going to stick with echo. It might be worthwhile looking in the PHP documentation about print and echo and understanding the differences between them. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to remove what we've done so far, but we're going to output I am. Now, what happens if I want to perhaps include a variable and concatenate it onto this string? So let's just go ahead and create a variable. We'll explain variables again at another point, but in this case, I'm just going to set this variable to the string Alex. So in this case, what I want to do is I want to say I am space, and I want to concatenate on or append, if you like, onto this echo language construct. So there's two ways that we can do this. With echo, we can use comma-separated values. So we could actually say Alex, and we've already seen this a moment ago when we looked at the single and double quote differences. But this would work as normal. You'll just see if we open up our browser, it says I am Alex. However, what we can also do is we can include things like variables here, which will then take into account what value we have stored in the variable, and will output whatever we have stored there. So we can change this around and refresh, and we get the expected output. Now, what we can also do is we can use the dot notation like this, and essentially what this is doing is it's concatenating the string, whereas before we were effectively passing multiple values to echo. So this would be the first value, this would be the second value. We're passing them in and they're just being concatenated, if you like, an output. But we can use concatenation like this where it makes sense. So again, there's no real difference between, well, there is, but there's no real difference in the results that we get from this. It would work perfectly in this exactly the same way if we were to use the single or the comma or the dot notation. But really it's preference and how it looks and everything like that. Generally it's better to comma separate, simply because when you're concatenating, it's probably a little bit slower. It's entirely unnoticeable probably, but it also looks a little nicer if we comma separate. But again, it's personal preference, and it depends on which coding standard you're following or which coding standard your team as a whole has decided to work with, or you in fact as an individual. So now that we've done that, we'll go ahead and we'll look at the curly braces or the complex syntax. Now, this isn't actually complex, but basically what it allows us to do is provide complex expressions and include these inside of a string. So for example, I'm going to say I am Alex. This is what we've seen before. We're just using double quotes. However, what happens if I again have this name variable up here, and I want to go ahead and include this name variable within here without either comma separating or concatenating on with the dot notation? Well, in this case, what I can actually do is provide curly braces within here and then use a complex inside of this. So this is just outputting a variable inside of here, but we can also work with arrays, objects, and anything like that inside of this complex syntax. So in this case, it just says I am Alex. And again, this looks a lot neater. So for example, I'm going to say town equals London. And I'm going to say I am name and I live in town. So it looks a lot nicer than having to comma separate or concatenate strings on here. When I refresh, this works as expected. So as we said, this also works with arrays. So what we can actually do is we can create a variable full of arrays. So for example, age. And this isn't a useful use case, but if we had, say, 20, 25, 30 in here, what we can actually do is say something like I am And then in here we can say age and access, say, the first element of age. So we can do things like this within these complex syntax. So we won't worry too much about that for now. But basically, we've looked at the ways that we can actually output to a page in PHP and how we do that basically using the echo language construct.